So good morning everyone, and welcome back if you joined us earlier, or welcome if it's the first session you've joined us today. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Alan Willend from Glenigan. He's the Economics Director at Glenigan, and he's going to give us the housing forecast, latest forecast for house building, and a review of last week's budget. So perfect timing. I think, Alan, you've had time to kind of digest what was in the budget and things perhaps that weren't mentioned but are coming online. So Alan, you've got 30 years of experience in providing insightful market analysis and forecasts for the construction sector and the built environment. And so perfectly placed to give us your take on where we're at. Whilst we're on here, I'd like to bring people's attention to the live discussion tab. So if you want to ask questions to Alan at the end of his presentation, I can put those to him directly. So please do get involved. So hi, Alan. Welcome to UK Net Zero House Building, and over to you.
Okay, thank you, Nathan, and good morning, everybody. As Nathan says, I'm Alan Willend. I'm the Economics Director at Glenigan. I've been there for about 12 years, and prior to that, I was the Economics Director at the Construction Products Association for many years. Glenigan, as many of you may be aware, but others may not be, we are a debt construction data company. So we collect and research effectively every construction project in the UK. We identify projects that are coming through the planning process, others that are not, and anything over 250,000 or 10 residential units. We'll then actively track those projects through the planning process, onto site, and through to completion. Now that's a fantastic resource for people who want to find out about specific projects, whether that's material suppliers, contractors or subcontractors. But from a strategic point of view, it also allows us to do a lot of analysis into where the market conditions are and where they're going. And really we use that as a central piece of information in our forecasts, which I'm going to talk about now. Our last major forecast was in November, and this is the overall data we had for what we call underlying construction project starts, so all manner of construction projects. And clearly we've been going through a very unpredictable time over the last sort of 2 years, really, if not even longer. And for that reason, we've produced our central forecast, which is where we based on a range of assumptions for the economy, for political side in terms of government policy and so forth, where we see the economy going, and that's the blue line on the chart there for overall construction activity. And then a best and worst case scenario around that to give you an idea of the range of unpredictability that we've got. Now, when we did our central forecast in November, the two key assumptions were that Brexit obviously would happen, and we would leave with at least some form of trade deal in place, which has happened, and also that whilst we could see successive and further national lockdowns as the government continued to tackle the COVID pandemic, construction sites as such wouldn't be closed down as perhaps they were in that initial lockdown we saw last March. So for all of that reason, actually our central forecast has held fairly true to this point, and certainly the path we've seen over the last few months has very much been following the path that we anticipated when we did our forecast in November. But I thought that was a useful starting point, really, as we go through and look at our forecast as it currently stands, in light of what we saw in the budget in terms of the wider economic forecast, and in terms of the government policies that are now coming into play. And if we start by looking at the wider UK economic projections, I think it's useful to look at the overall growth profile for the UK economy as produced by the official forecasts that accompany the budget, produced by the OBR, and compare that with what they themselves were expecting in November last year. And I think the interesting thing from that, as you can see, is that you can very clearly see the disruption that we've seen over the last year. in terms of the impact of the pandemic. Output fell by around 10% last year for the economy as a whole. It's a 300-year record, but it's actually not as bad as was feared at the time. When we look back at last November, they were expecting 11.5% decline. So it's much more, so that's a positive sign. And actually, as we go forward from that, that has implications for the path of recovery, both this year and next. So having not fallen back quite so dramatically, still dramatically, but not quite so dramatically as initially feared, actually the pace of growth is slightly slower this year. But as you can see from the chart, it's still way above the rates you'd have normally historically have seen in the economy, really because we've got that initial bounce back from large parts of the economy being closed down for much of last year. So for the current year, we now expect the OBR expects the economy to grow by about 4%, as opposed to 5.5% when they were forecasting in November. But that then grows subsequently to pick up further as we get into next year, growing by 7.3%, as opposed to a 6.6% rise they were expecting in November. And then it kind of moves back to the trend that they were previously anticipating in the subsequent years, 2023 and 2024. Now, within that overall picture for the economy, I think if you look at the particular drivers that are of importance to construction and to housing, household spending and business investment, both of those fell back last year, but again, not as dramatically as initially feared, and they certainly were included in the OBR's November forecast. But both are now expected to recover more slowly this year. In fact, business investment is expected to remain in negative territory, whereas household spending is expected to pick up, but as I say, not quite as strongly as in percentage terms as was anticipated in November. Conversely, government investment didn't really come through last year to the extent that was previously anticipated. It's taken a while, inevitably, for government policy to translate into action on the ground. So there's been a bit of a carry forward to this year, and certainly during the course of 2021, the OBR is now expecting government investment to grow by over 17%, 17.8% in fact, this year. So a real surge of government investment, some of which will be going into construction and into housing areas such as social housing. All of which I think overall balance, I think broadly fits with what we were anticipating in November, but it also coincides with what some of the measures that came forward in the Chancellor's budget. Given that, as I said, that there's a concern about slight weakness in the path of the recovery, particularly in household spending and business investment, you can see a lot of the measures that the Chancellor has really introduced in the budget generally for the wider economy and for housing, were very much aimed at trying to smooth and guide both the economy and the housing market through the sort of post-COVID recovery over the next couple of years. Certainly if we look at, going the other way, certainly if you look at the OBR's own forecasts, again, accompanying the budget for the wider housing market, you can see the initial, in the sharp spike downwards and then bouncing back over the last year in property transactions, the disruption that the housing market has suffered due to the initial closure, effectively, of the housing market in March last year. And then the subsequent surge in demand and a mini boom, really, in the housing market that we've seen to date, in part fueled by government action last year, and not least the move to cut stamp duty rates temporarily until March this year. Now, clearly, and it's interesting if you compare this forecast with the one that OBR had in November, you can see that spike that we're currently enjoying at the moment in terms of property transactions has been elongated a little bit in the OBR's forecast. And what they're trying to do is really, or Chancellor in the budget was trying to smooth out the transition and the removal of that current stamp duty reduction through into the second half of this year with a phased withdrawal. And I think that's a real positive move that will help to stabilise the housing market. The other measure that he introduced again was the mortgage guarantee scheme. Again, that's a relatively temporary scheme. It runs from April through to December next year. And again, I think the intention with that is really to help provide general support to the housing market at a time when I think conditions are going to be quite shaky in the wider economy, in terms of consumer confidence as well, and the wider and in the housing market. Unemployment is still expected to rise sharply, slightly less than initially feared, but it's still expected to peak at around 6.5%, I think, in the final half of this year. Again, I think that'll be a dent to consumer confidence, hence the measures to provide targeted support now as we go forward over the coming sort of 12 to 18 months. So how does that fit in with the data that we have for the housing market and how we anticipate things to play out in terms of new housing activity over the next 2 years? Well, certainly if you look at private housing approvals, these are detailed planning consents. You've seen a sort of steady climb for a number of years in sort of the number of projects and number of units secured on those projects, securing planning consent, really I think until sort of up to 2019. Now clearly last year there was a significant disruption to the approval process. You can see that most clearly obviously in the second quarter of last year. We got that very sharp drop in the number of approvals, but it did recover quite strongly when it got into the third and fourth quarter of last year. I think that second quarter disruption was very much due to the organisational side of things and adapting to the restrictions in terms of putting applications through during the initial lockdown, and then also the approval process from local authorities' perspective as well. I think it's quite encouraging that so many projects did secure approval actually during the second quarter, given the initial restrictions and the fears that we were facing. And as I say, it has sprung back quite strongly, although it's not back at the levels it was in 2019. Having said that, as I say, we've seen a steady climb in approvals for a number of years, and there's quite a strong pipeline of projects now that can move on site. So I think we're in a strong supply position at the moment going forward. In addition to that, the government is continuing to provide direct support to the housing market through the Help to Buy. These are the number of applications, and you see how it's progressively climbed up to 2019. Yes, it fell off in the first half of last year as a direct result of the pandemic, but it has started to come back quite well, or we would expect it to come back quite well in the second half of last year and getting into this year. Clearly, the scheme's now been scaled back to just provide support to first-time buyers, but nevertheless, it's going to be an important area of support to help drive new house sales over the next year. Which then takes us to the overall forecast. And so this was a forecast we produced in November, but I think by and large it holds sway as we look forward to the next couple of years. Certainly we've got a strong development pipeline potentially there, as I was saying, in terms of the planning approvals, but we have got sort of the prospect of weaker household earnings growth over the forecast period over the next couple of years, and obviously that sharp rise in unemployment, which again is going to be a dent to consumer confidence generally. What we've seen over the last sort of 6 months or so is house builders, we seem to have been prioritising existing sites and building those out. So it's been a focus on perhaps on completions or new project starts, and that's reflected in our data, where we actually count actual projects starting on site rather than individual units starting on site. Saw that sharp dramatic fall, particularly in the second quarter of last year, and a subsequent recovery, but nevertheless, overall, a dramatic fall last year. And we expect that to, as I say, to be a steady recovery over the next 2 years. One of the factors we had that was a concern was the fact that we had this withdrawal of the stamp duty exemptions or reductions, really posing as a potential cliff edge in the end of this month. I think the fact that that's now been eased and extended, I think will help to provide some additional confidence going forward, plus the wider, perhaps a boost of confidence that we're seeing from the rapid rollout of the vaccination program. All of things I think will feed through into consumer confidence a little bit. So I expect that actually the recovery will be a little bit stronger than we were perhaps forecasting in November. But nevertheless, I think that the path is quite clear there, and I don't think it's necessarily going to catch up and return to where we were in 2019, for example, over the next couple of years. Moving on to the social housing side of things. In Glenigan's own data, we include student accommodation there, which in 2019, prior to the pandemic, accounted for about a quarter of all work in the sector. Another 75% is effectively social or affordable housing projects. As we can see from the chart on the right, from the data from the HCA, there had been a steady climb in projects and going through and coming onto site. And there had been something recovering on the affordable side over the last couple of financial years, but that fell off during the first half of the last financial year as a direct result really of the initial hiatus in terms of the pandemic. It's actually individual project starts and therefore unit starts that were most directly affected during the pandemic, and the social housing sector in particular seemed to suffer more extended lockdowns and was slower to come back on site during the first national lockdown. Having said that, I think the prospects going forward are really positive for this sector. As I say, you can see that dramatic fall that we anticipated or estimated for the course of 2020 in our forecasts. But we expect this sector, very much led by an increase in investment in affordable housing, to drive a strong growth over the next 2 years, which will take it up above the levels it was prior to the pandemic. A couple of factors really driving that. First of all, housing associations find themselves in a better financial position than they did previously. There's been a relaxation of some of the restrictions in terms of rent increases, for example, which is going to allow them more flexibility to work, to take forward more projects and have the funding stream to fund those. In addition to that, going back to the substantial increase in government capital funding that was highlighted by the OBR alongside the budget, if there is a substantial increase in funding in government investment generally, and in addition, including additional support for the social housing sector, again, more available grants and so forth should enable and to support further growth within the social housing sector over the next 2 years. So it's a really positive picture for that sector as a whole. So this was our forecast overall, which you can see, as you can see, it shows the sharp disruptive decline we suffered in 2020, but really a path for recovery over the next 2 years, with both an upturn in private housing activity and even stronger growth in social housing activity. And in sort of numbers terms, as you can see, that growth in quite clearly there, that strong double-digit growth in both parts of the new housing sector over the course of 2021 with further growth being sustained into 2022. So hopefully that provides a useful overview. And now I'd like to open it up to any questions that people may have.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alan, for that. That was great, and it's nice to hear some positive forecasts there for the future. I guess one of the questions we've come up here is around the supply chain. I mean, in your forecast, there is that something you factor in? Because I know in the first lockdown, as we came out of the first lockdown, there were challenges around building materials, accessibility to some building materials. Now we've got Brexit, which seems to have had less of an impact so far than people perhaps first thought, but maybe that's because we were in a lockdown when it first kicked in. Are they all factors that you've looked in your forecast?
Yeah, certainly that was something that we were looking at in our forecast in terms of overall supply. And you mentioned Brexit, for example. One of the things we were putting together when we were putting together the alternative scenarios, sort of the worst case scenario was a no-deal Brexit, for example, with increased tariffs, for example, on products, and a much more, even worse friction, perhaps, on the border than we initially saw, sort of following sort of the beginning of the year. So, yes, it is something we took into account. It's going to be interesting. One of the other pressures, obviously, it seems to be starting to emerge quite clearly now, is the fact that as all the economies across the world unlock, actually, there's a pressure on prices as well, an upward pressure on prices, and that could well be a factor going forward that could squeeze things. I noticed on the steel front, for example, steel prices have risen quite dramatically. Maybe the housing side maybe slightly less susceptible to that than some other parts of construction, but nevertheless, I think it is a sort of a factor. And the other thing that we were concerned about, and I think is a factor, is not just on the material side, it's the labour supply side of things and how that plays out. Near term, obviously, people having to work with reduced staff on site, which is slowing the pace of output. And then sort of long term is whether the supply chain, in terms of overall availability of labour supplies, is going to be a factor post-Brexit.
So that's interesting. I know with this event today, a lot of people have said that they're looking for modern methods of construction solutions and off-site solutions for house building. I mean, do you think that's kind of going to force that to happen even more? And I know Homes England now have got a task force on this as well. I guess again, is that something that's factored into why your forecasts are pretty positive?
I think clearly that is an issue, and that's going to be, and as I say, particularly there's cost pressures and that material and particularly labour supply, site labour supply, so that's going to increase the pressure to move down that modern methods route. And it's interesting that that's one of the things we try and track at Glenigan, is by whether projects are using some form of MMC or not. And certainly it's been noticeable that there's been a number of inquiries that we're seeing, people searching for those sort of terms when they're trying to research individual projects. I think, as you say, a lot of people are interested in trying to go down that route, I think.
Okay. And yeah, I think probably my last question then is what, with obviously today we're looking at net zero housing and trying to meet these government targets. As these regulations come in, do you think that will have any impact on the ability of the sector to meet the demand, or actually do you think that we're in a pretty good place now when it comes to building net zero homes?
I'm not too, to be honest, I'm not too sure in terms of the technical detail for it, but I think that the key principles that it would be that I think it's important that the government clearly signposts where it wants to go and have a clear timetable which allows industry and suppliers to gear up and make sure that the materials and the capacity is there, whether that's capacity in terms of product or in available skills to deliver those products on site. And then once you've got that clear sort of roadmap or so forth, then actually the industry, I think, can respond to that in the most cost-effective way to deliver what's needed.
Yeah, no, that's it. I think, it certainly feels like we're beginning to see. I mean, I think I can imagine that it's been almost impossible trying to forecast, Alan, for the last few months, but now you've got some solid ground to be able to do that, and hopefully, as an industry, that will happen as well, as we can see with the net zero targets. That thing, there are targets to hit, and we know what's coming down the line. Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Alan. I think you and your team are online today because you've got an exhibitor profile. So if anyone wants to ask questions directly, they can come and meet with you on the platform. I believe you've got colleagues available today.
That's right. I think so. Yes. So so do have a look, and they can sort of ferry any questions through.
Perfect. Yeah, I think people can connect with any of our exhibitors on the. So if you go to the exhibitor list, Glenigan have got a profile there, but also all our other suppliers and exhibitors today. So you can book meetings with them during the day and after today as well. So if you haven't got time today, you can always arrange a meeting after today as well. So brilliant. Thank you very much, Alan, and look forward to perhaps maybe we'll have another update from you for our next event, which will be May, and hopefully we'll see you in October at the main event, UK Construction Week.
So, and hopefully each time we'll get more positive with any luck.
I hope so. I think it's all getting more positive every day. Absolutely.
Okay.
Brilliant.
All right.
Cheers. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.